everyone. Hello, hello. Hello. This is working. I'll just pass it back and forth. Welcome, Sam, to Calcutta. I was just reading your book and connecting it to all sorts of things. This is a city which we know was a city of 2.3 million people in 1939. Of course, built by migrants who came and set up around 2 or 3 villages. Then they developed the city, and from the city they developed the empire, and then the whole dynamic between who's migrants and what's stationary and what's not, which your book set me thinking about. And then the city multiplies and quadruples in size in the war years and partition and famine. And we are still dealing with the effects of those waves and waves of migrants, really. And all of us who try and escape the bounds of the city, get away, come back, all of that. So makes very interesting reading. I haven't read all of it. I'm reading it slowly, really enjoying it. But just to start off, how did you start off with thinking about writing this book?
Well, it's a book that is that okay? Can you hear me? Yeah.
Hello, hello.
Okay. Thanks, Ruchir. It's a book that had some false starts. It's a book that aims to go back to the beginning of our history in a way that reminds us of what we actually all know, and that we're fundamentally migratory. But one of the problems I had writing it at the beginning is that many of the modern arguments about migration are just so toxic, so unpleasant, so nasty, so able to split apart families or political parties, that it was almost impossible to find common ground. And I'm seeking that common ground in our deep history and in our more recent history, and saying that, look, hang on, every city in this world, every country is full of people who are descended from migrants or who are migrants themselves. Ruchir, absolutely you're right. This city knows it's a migrant city because it grew so recently, so large so recently. A lot of other places around the world deny their migration past. And for me, that's evidently, obviously untrue. And I wanted to try and shift back to imagining a world in which being a migrant is not an anomaly, but something that says something about every single one of us. Migrants are treated as though they are odd and different and unusual, and often a lot worse than that if they're poor or coming from a poorer country. So it's really an attempt to shift that debate onto something that I think most people actually recognize.
Yes, absolutely. It's fascinating because Sam goes back to prehistoric times where the first creatures, record of the first creatures that we found who have crawled out of the sea onto land, which is in North Canada somewhere now. And there's nothing there. It's like human beings on the moon. And hardly any trees, no other animals. And from there, those ancestors of ours populate the whole planet, and from there we get dinosaurs, then they die out. Hundreds of other species, thousands of other species die out, but they're moving all the time. And when we come to us bipeds, when we come to Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, again the movements are crisscrossing, almost like Shambazar or Piccadilly Circus, you know, around the Bosphorus or around Europe or around that area around Syria and Iraq. It's hilarious, your search for your Neanderthal DNA. Can you tell us a bit about what made you go into that, and what about our DNA? What do you reckon? Because we're all very, we just seen the CAA protests which were shut down because of COVID, and then we saw a huge migration within the country of labor workers trying to come back home, and that's another kind of migration. And now we've got the Rohingyas sitting at the edge of Bangladesh over there. So we are again, it's migration is very much, we're in the middle of it, you know. Even as we try and send our kids to Europe and to to Kota to learn or whatever. So Neanderthals.
Yeah, well, one small way that the story of migration has changed in recent years is our ability to do DNA tests. I'm sure some of you have done that yourselves. And what that tends to tell you is where your ancestors were a few hundred years ago. But it tells you one other thing as well, is what percentage Neanderthal you are. And almost everyone who doesn't have an unbroken line of African heritage is partly Neanderthal. It's usually between 2 and 4%. And that interests me partly because of the way Neanderthals have been considered. It's still a word that's used by politicians, by people who want to describe the uncivilized. Well, we're all, probably all of us here, are descended from Neanderthals. The idea that Neanderthals died out, indeed, just isn't true. I think the other point is that these DNA tests remind us of that we have traveled to almost every part of the world, and that we're unusual as a species. As a land mammal, there is no other species that has migrated as much as us, except the rat, and the rat has followed us wherever we've gone. If an alien came down to Earth and started categorizing all the species they found, I think the first thing they would be amazed at is not our buildings or our cities or our weapons, but that we are everywhere. We're pretty well on every part of the land surface, even a few hundred people on Antarctica. And we're unique in that.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating because then Sam takes us into the mythological, the migrations in the Bible, the migrations to do with the Roman Empire, the migrations to do with movements across Eurasia and how the people in the Mayflower land up in America, and before that the first slave ship that arrives into the United States. And there again we see that it's not a simple one-way journey, it's a back and forth, as a toggling of populations all across time, and you try and visualize it in an animation map. It's fascinating because the stories we've been handed down have been a little bit of movement of arrows and then settlements. That's what we were taught in school, and that's just wrong, you know. Recently the debates we've been having about where we come from, who is Aryan, who's not, the whole business of actual Aryans in Germany during the mid-20s, what you were saying, they were Roma, the closest to Indians and Aryans. The Germans, of course, confected this idea of a blonde, blue-eyed Aryan, which is a myth. Here we have the myth today, which people are debating, maybe Sam, you could speak to that, about where the original North Indian population comes from. The Dravidians, I would take it, traveled out of Africa and settled earlier in the Deccan Peninsula, right?
I mean, the bottom line is that we're all out of Africa, if you believe the geneticists, and there have been lots of migrations over the probably 80,000 years that India has been populated by human beings. What interests me is how arguments about when and where those migrations happened almost split along political lines today. That migration has become a proxy for a whole range of other issues that affect this country. That if you have a certain idea of India, you are much more likely to have the notion that Indians, as we know them, have been here for a very long time. If you have another idea, then it tends to be the opposite. it happens in lots of countries, but it blocks out the science and it blocks out the history, and that worries me. In most countries around the world, until very recently, people were proud of their migrant origins. In Europe, for instance, most countries had migration myths. I talk, for instance, about Rome's migration myth, which was that they came from Troy, that Aeneas of Troy travelled to Rome and founded it. Lots of other countries followed suit and copied those ideas. They were proud of their migration past. Until probably about the late 19th century, when we saw nationalist movements take over, and there they were arguing, no, we've always been here, we're sons of the soil. They will use a number of phrases to suggest that those who are in a particular place have always been in that place. And sure, some of them have been there for a long time, but in the context of our long, deep history, more than, let us say, 700,000 years as a separate species, we're newcomers wherever we are. The one place where that's not true, and possibly it's true in Kolkata and other cities which are very aware of their migratory past, is North America, where different groups there are very proud on the whole of their recent migrations, or very aware of them at least. And what I'd like to do, if that's okay, is to read a
I was
tiny
going to
bit.
suggest, yeah, exactly, yeah.
So this is a... So this is an experiment that I really want to try out on all of you. I'm going to ask a question at the end of this passage. If you know the answer already, don't answer. But I want you to guess and see whether you can work it out. Try this. Tell a friend the story of Joseph Kearney, for he was an Irishman, a middle-aged shoemaker in the tiny village of Moneygall in County Offaly, born and brought up there in the late 18th century. And like hundreds of thousands of other people from Ireland, Kearney migrated to America during the Great Famine, settling in the Midwestern state of Ohio. Once there, he sent back home for his family, his wife and 3 children, and they all came to Ohio and became citizens of the USA in the days when it was easier to do such things. Joseph Kearney died an American. Now tell your friend that a descendant of Joseph Kearney of the Irish village of Moneygall became President of the United States, and then ask your friend to guess the name of the president. So, who might it be? Any guesses? Who might that president be? Kennedy? Any other guesses? Who? Carter? What? She says Biden. Anyone else? Okay, I'll tell you the answer. You want to guess?
Roosevelt? No, can't be Roosevelt. Trump.
One of you, most unusually, got the answer right. Most people, I write, get it wrong again and again. They try Clinton or the Bushes or Reagan or Kennedy or Biden or even Donald Trump. The answer is Barack Obama, who was the great-great-great-grandson of Joseph Kearney, the shoemaker from Moneygall. Obama himself has complex and eloquent views on race and of his own racial heritage, and he wouldn't be surprised or offended, I think, that many people wouldn't choose him as an obvious descendant of an Irish shoemaker. Obama considers himself black, but has always been keen to embrace his mixed heritage. During that first election, when he became president, Barack Obama's identity served as a battleground. He faced accusations from the right that he was a foreigner or a Muslim or both, and was even declared by one to be an antichrist, while to a variety of genealogical pedants and amateur logicians, Obama was quite simply not black by the fact of being half white, which meant, therefore, that he could only be considered biracial or of mixed race, and his own views had no relevance in the matter. There were challenges from elsewhere to Obama's identity and his right to self-identify as black, particularly when he was first nominated as a presidential candidate. Some black Americans were not won over by what they saw as a blackness that was only skin deep. Is he really black? They asked rhetorically. The writer Deborah Dickerson declared simply, Obama isn't black, and explained that black in our political and social reality means those that descended from West African slaves. She was particularly unimpressed by all the white people swooning over Obama. You're not embracing a black man, a descendant of slaves. You're replacing the black man with an immigrant of recent African descent, of whom you can approve without feeling either guilty or frightened. The debate about Obama's identity swirled on through his presidency and was a reminder of a deeper, wider malaise in American life. It's not hard to see this debate as a symbol of unfinished business, of the extent to which race and slavery and the many migrations of the past continue to play a central role in American politics and society. Those migrations are at the heart of many familiar stories that are told today about the USA and its origins. And I cannot claim, as I have about other times and places, particularly in Europe and Asia, that migration tales have been ignored. It's different in the USA. Migration is center stage. I'll just add a footnote to that, because after he was elected president, genealogists discovered or revealed that Obama was, in fact, descended from slaves, but through his white mother, whose family had been in America for a very long time. And just going back to those DNA tests, if you ever want to laugh, go on YouTube, see the videos of white American chauvinists learning that they have recent black heritage. That's very good.
Yeah, it's a running joke between me and friends that a lot of Bengalis are descended from Arakan pirates, and especially Jyoti Basu back in the days. And now I guess if you look at Mohammad, perhaps an Arakan pirate is not too much to imagine. I mean, there is the swashbuckling aspect to all of that. As someone whose parents came from Gujarat, and people still treat me as, apni to Bangali known. I am not, I'm a migrant. I have a question for you, after which perhaps we could open it up to the Q&A. You've laid out the history of us as a moving, mobile species over the last, 100,000, 200,000 years? 100,000 years. This continent, 80,000, you reckon, right? With everything that's happening in the world today, whether it's wars or climate change, what does the future look like? Do we go back, majority of us, to being a mobile race, a mobile species again? Do you reckon? Does stationariness become unstable as, the sea eats up the land and places become, what would you just give us a projection?
I mean, there are lots of reasons for migration, obviously. Climate change is going to be a major force causing climate change from areas whose agriculture or whose land will change beyond recognition. But other natural disasters, war will continue to be reasons. But I argue very strongly that a lot of us migrate for other reasons. Yes, in search of jobs and so on. But actually, if you look at that deep history, there's a desire among quite a lot of us simply to be on the move, whether it's in our own countries or beyond. I also argue, for instance, that pilgrimages and holidays have become almost proxies that deal with that urge that we have to move, that we move a little bit each year back and forth, and that helps deal with something that is fundamental to us as a species, that we are migratory. For others, like me, I want to be on the move as much as I can. Go to as many countries, see as many new places, usually not as a tourist if I can avoid it, preferably with work, because then you get a real sense of the place. Tourists aren't migrants, but migrant workers are.
The future then?
The future, yes, we'll carry on migrating.
No, will it increase suddenly? Do
So,
you see a sudden rapid rupture?
We will think it increases as we think it's increasing now. In fact, the levels of migration have not really changed that much. There are occasionally, say at times of partition here, at the end of the Second World War, when you get mass movements. But actually, in terms of the percentage of the human population which is mobile and migratory, and obviously it depends on what definition you take of who a migrant is, it hasn't changed that much. There's a wonderful new book which sets out each sort of famous migration myth and shows that actually so little has changed. We migrate. We migrate for a range of reasons. We have always done so.
Great. I'm not going to throw this open to question and answer. Som, why don't we start with you?
Afternoon, Ruchir. Sam, two questions, Sam, for you. One is on present-day politics in England, and the second is about class and power behind movement. Why do politicians who are refugees or migrants themselves seem so keen to shut the door behind them? That is one, in the UK at the moment. Second is, and you've mentioned this in your book, in present-day politics and situations, there is a certain amount of class and privilege behind movement. So would you just tell us a bit about being an immigrant or emigrating, and what is the class politics of that? Thanks.
Sure. I mean, I think you almost answered it, so I think a lot of them feel, hey, let's shut the door behind me. You're absolutely right. In Britain, there are quite a large number of very well-known anti-migrant politicians who are migrants themselves or first generation. And it's striking how many of them stand up and say no more. You can argue that's just a kind of, hey, that's what I feel, I'm selfish, I got in, why let any more of me in? There are lots of others who don't, but it's very noticeable in the Conservative Party at the moment that they're there and playing a very important role in politics. On the class thing, so immigration and emigration are the same thing. Immigration is incoming, emigration is outgoing. Immigration is normally used to mean poor people from poorer countries, and the reverse for emigration. And it's just one of the nonsenses, partly of the English language, but it's replicated in lots of others, that we don't recognize that every immigrant is an emigrant and vice versa. There is no difference between them. You're just looking at them from a different vantage point. More so on the language, for instance, is the word expat, which has and still is used for people like me because I'm white and because I'm reasonably well off. I think if you want to play with that, do so. I write in the book, and just whenever anyone tells you that they're an expat, ask them, oh, you're a migrant worker, because that's what they are. They're migrant workers just like every other migrant workers. This idea that there's some very special category for people whose color and income is different is, again, it's a semantic nonsense. Where's the dividing line? What's the difference between an expat and a migrant worker? And you will find people coming up with very complex legalistic definitions. But in the end, we're all migrants, and we need to recognize that. Anyone else?
Anyone else?
Yeah.
Thanks so much for getting some sense of your book, but could you give me a sense of the trajectory of the book, the key argument that takes us throughout the narrative?
Sure. I mean, the central argument is that we are migrants, we're fundamentally migratory, and that in the past we recognize that. For instance, I look in great detail, or in some detail, at the Bible, and pitch the Bible as fundamentally a migratory handbook. Every story in the Bible, certainly in the Old Testament, is really about a migration. I look at it in terms of other early works. I take that through to Rome. I take it through to the expansion of Islam, the role of the Vikings at the same period in Northern Europe, that migrants are making our world. And what I'm arguing is that we recognized that in most places until quite recently, until the age of nationalism. And then we got caught up in this, and it kind of squeezed our imagination. We could only imagine a world with borders and with passports and with visas, and where you belong to the country you were born in, or you might belong to another country, but it's very hard to get there. These are very recent innovations in human history. The wonderful Central European novelist, writer Stefan Zweig writes, just before he dies, as a migrant exile in Brazil, he writes about how he tells students that when he was a young boy, i.e. before the First World War, he traveled all around the world without a passport. And I'm not saying that we can suddenly get rid of all passports or anything like that, but it's an important reminder of how things that we take for granted as almost sacred, we expect our young to die for borders. Most of these borders are recent inventions of humans, usually men with a map drawing something on it. And we've got to desacralize them in a way, to remember that we humans invented them. And insofar as they're useful to us, okay, maybe they'll continue to exist. But do they perform a useful function? Because actually what's happened is that they tend to end up just defining us as individuals. You are from such and such a country, and that's the first thing that anyone says about an individual. And I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah, one of my questions was going to be that the nation state is the big elephant in the room, isn't it? And we are all examining that. Any other questions or comments? Because we have 10 more seconds, and then I think we have to wrap up. It's a bit been... yeah, go ahead. One last question, please. Yeah.
Last question, yeah.
Yeah, hi. This is Aditya. I have not exactly migrated, but I've actually lived in 4 cities in India, right? Now, I think I've started calling myself urban nomad. Right. So, and it's not always like the work. Sometimes you might just want to change a city for the taste of it. Right now, I'm here in Calcutta. I don't know where I'm going to be 6 months down the line, right? So, where the work takes us. So, what's your comment on like migration, expats who are settled for a long time, and urban nomads?
So nomads is a word that has come back in. Once upon a time, it only used to refer to people who lived, who are usually very poor by our standards in monetary income, and it's been adopted. And I kind of welcome this because it sort of it normalizes the term for a wider group of people. That we get these glomads, glamorous nomads, we get urban nomads, we get lots of other kinds of nomads who are often quite well off, can work from anywhere and do work from anywhere. Personally, that's a kind of lifestyle that suits me, but it's at the moment we got to see it as something that's a small niche. Funnily enough, in lots of countries, I think COVID created the notion that one didn't need to go to one's place of work nearly as often as people thought we did, or that you could work from a very long distance. And I think that does change things for people, for deciding where people need to be, and you don't need to be in the city where your work is.
Yeah, ironically, because you don't need to be tied to the office, you become a nomad again and can. Right. Thank you, Sam. I urge everyone to grab a copy of the book and get it signed while Sam is here. Well done. Thank you all.